All right, today we're going to go over the router table. The router is probably one of the most universal tools that you can actually buy. So if you were out there and you wanted to get into woodworking and you wanted to buy certain tools, two certain tools that are probably a must would be a table saw and a router. The reason is the router can be used as almost any other tool in the shop. So you can use the router as a joiner. You can use the router to cut dados like you cut on the radial arm saw when you were cutting your footstool dados. You can use the router to make cabinet doors. You can use the router to put a decorative edge on, and that's what you're going to do as you work with your footstool. You're going to put a decorative edge on the top of your footstool. But the router is very versatile. Now the router just comes as a one unit. So this whole thing together, if you can see, is called a router table because the router is encompassed in this. And you don't need to have a router table of this quality. My own router table that I have at home is more or less this quality here. This is probably about a $200 router table. This is probably about a $1,000 router table. But the reason we have an industrial one is because we use it extensively with hundreds of kids a day, where something like this would be adequate if you were at home and wanted to have your own router table. When I first started teaching in this shop, there was not a router table, and to get by for the year, when I first started, I actually built my own router table out of plywood, and it worked for a couple years until we bought this one, and then later on we ended up buying two of these. And these are just nice because they kind of stay put. They're a heavy structure. They have a nice cast iron top on them. They have a nice fence system where when you build your own, you're kind of makeshifting, you're clamping fences on. The guards aren't quite as good as they should be. These come with custom slots for the guards to go in, so these are just a little bit more user-friendly for you guys here in the shop. But just to kind of give you a general rundown, this, like any of the other machines and any of the other parts, this is your table, this is your fence. In the back side, if you pick up this hose, the router does create a ton of dust. So if you can put this hose, there is a slot in the back that accepts that hose and it collects the dust as you're routing. So I'll kind of go through this and show you how to actually take this apart, disassemble, change out a bit, and set the fence and the bit up properly. Now, this is a generalization. You have to learn what each router bit actually does, and in this class, the router bit here does a ton of different things. So if you look under here, there are a plethora of different bits, and this is just one shelf, and there's I don't know 10 or 12 different bits here. So there's bits here, there's bits in here, there's another 10 or 12, there's bits in these, and every one of those bits does something different. And every one of those bits is set up differently. So as you get into your upper level courses and you start to look at the plans, it's going to say, well, you're going to need a 1/2-inch router bit, or you're going to need a 3/4 cove bit, or you're going to need a slotting bit, or a dovetail bit, or a dado bit. And it depends on what that bit is and what process you're trying to do and how you actually set the router up. So for this one here, we're simply putting a decorative edge on your footstool, and it's not all that difficult. So what you want to do first, when you come over here, because there's several different classes and several different levels of classes, from Woodtech 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to Cabinetry 1 to Cabinetry 2, we have 6 different classes, and these routers get set up especially by the upper level kids in Woodtech 3 and 4, and in cabinetry, sometimes a kid will put 2 or 3 bits in it a day, and each one of those bits performs a different function. So what we're going to teach you is how you take this apart, get the router out of it, loosen the bit, put a new bit in, and how we put it back together. So the first thing you do is get this hose out of the way for now. You can put it anywhere you want, just get it out of the way. Loosen these there's 2 thumb screws, and I'll show you them from here. There's a thumb screw here and a thumb screw here, and as you see, there's a bolt here, and those bolts go into these T-slots here, and they tighten up to hold the fence in place. So you want to move the fence out of the way. The next thing you want to do is there are 2 screws on the left and on the right of this, and under these cabinets we keep a screwdriver. Where's my screwdriver? Oh, there it is. So we keep a screwdriver, and there's a screw here and a screw here. if you find yourself grabbing a Phillips head screwdriver, you are loosening the wrong bolts. That's what holds the router in. These bolts here, or these screws, hold the table in. That's this blue part. So what you want to do is just loosen that table insert. So you come over here, it's a flathead screw, and it's a flathead screw in the other corner. Loosen those up. They shouldn't be in there with 10 tons of force. If they are, somebody tightened it too tight. The only thing that these screws do is hold this faceplate or this down into the table. So once you do that, you got your 2 screws there. You put your screwdriver aside, you open up your bottom door, and you push up on the whole unit. That brings the whole router out of the table. You put it over here. Now, this is the router. So if you were going to the store, what you would buy would be this, okay? It wouldn't come with a router table. If you want to buy it, you have to buy those 2 things separately. But a router table is very versatile, but you can use a router as a handheld router. You can use it, hold it in your hand and route things like that. Now what you do is, if you look right here, this is called a cam clamp. So what you do is you put your finger behind there and you open up the cam clamp. That loosens the base of this, okay? And then you take this button right here, okay, and you push that in and it slides up and off of there. Now these are, get a lot of dust in there, you want to kind of clean that out. It makes it a little bit easier when you go to put it back together so it doesn't bind up inside of this collar and it slides back on top of there. If you look, there's a hole here, and if you look here, there's a shaft. The 2 of those have to line up and you have to push that button, and that's what holds this base to the actual motor of the router. Now what you do is you have to remove this bit, and you have to, if the correct bit is in, you don't have to remove it, but if you have to change the bit out, you need to take these 2 wrenches, which hang on the side of the cabinet. You put 1 wrench on the top of the router and 1 wrench on the bottom. When they're offset like this, it's real easy to loosen this. The top wrench, just like you open a pop bottle cap, needs to turn in this direction, which is counterclockwise or left. It's lefty-loosey, righty-tighty, and then the bottom one needs to push in the opposite direction. If you want to fight yourself, you can go over here and try to loosen this bolt like this, and you're going to fight with yourself trying to see which one's going what way. But if you put one on the top and offset the other one on the bottom, and you go like this and just squeeze with one hand, that will loosen. And when you loosen that, you can take it now by hand and loosen it a little bit more, and then it's going to lock again, and you have to do the same thing. So you have to come over here and loosen it one more time. You can see that bit just dropped. It was up here and it dropped back down. You can take your bit out. Now the part that actually holds the router bit is called a collet. So if you look at this, the collet right here, this bit goes inside of there like so. So when this gets pulled down into the router, it's on a taper. I don't know if you can see the taper, but this is on a taper, and it gets pulled down in and grabs that bit. So when you want to put the bit back in, or a different bit, you open up, you figure out what bit you need, you put the bit back in, and you, opposite of the way you took it out, you tighten it like so. Once it gets tight, what you want to do, and I'm going to show you, you want to pick up on the router bit a little bit. The bit should not be buried in the router or into the collet. And the reason for that is, if you look at a bit actually, right here, let me see if this camera will focus on this here. There we go. If you look where that purple part is, it's actually tapered in just a little bit, which means it goes from a 1/4 inch where the silver part is down to the purple part. There's a taper there. So when you go to actually put this router bit into the router, if you let that taper go down into the collet, it's only going to grab on that little area that's tapered. That's why you want to hand tighten this and pick the bit up a little bit, about a 1/4 inch, 1/8 of an inch, just to get it off that taper. You should be able to see some of the silver of the bit that's here. Let me make sure this camera refocused. Oh, there we go. So you should see some of the silver of the bit, and if you don't see that, you need to redo it, because if that bit flies out of there, it's not going to be good. So you want to make sure that you pull that out a little bit, and then you put your wrenches back on, one on the top, one on the bottom, one on top. You give it a tighten. Once you get it tightened and snug, You can squeeze that pretty good. You don't need to squeeze it with 10,000 pounds of force, but you want to make sure you have adequate pressure on there so that this bit wouldn't fall back out. The next thing you want to do, you want to re-put your housing back on. This comes over here. You want to line this specific hole up with this shaft. So you get down like this. Sometimes you got to get down on the router, make sure you got it lined up. And then just the opposite, you push this black button the same way you took it off, and you get it to where you want the bit to be. Now every bit gets adjusted to a different height. They're not common. So this specific bit that I have in there, let me grab a similar bit, and then we'll go over that a little bit. But this specific bit here, let me get this zoomed in on this. This specific bit here is called a roundover bit, and when you adjust this shoulder of the bit right here, that gets adjusted so that that is flush with the top of the blue table, just this shoulder right here. So you can see from an end, this shoulder right there gets adjusted to the top part of this blue table. Let me readjust the focus. And so when I go to do that, what I want to do is once I rapidly traverse this up and down like this, there's also a micro tune right under here that I can turn to get it roughly where I want it, and that will raise it so that I'm not trying to push up and down on this rapidly. I can get it and look down on it and raise that blue table up till it's flush with this top, okay? So you want that shoulder that we talked about to be flush with this for this specific bit. And you'll learn as we start to go over some different bits how to set up each bit that you're actually going to work with. Once you get that done, what you want to do is you want to lock this over. You're going to reinsert the router and the table back into the router table. You have your two screws. This is opposite of the way you took it out. That goes like so. This goes like so. You take your screwdriver. You don't have to snug this up with 10,000 pounds of force. You just need to hold it down into the table. Go like that and like that. Once you do that, anything on the table you want to get rid of so that when you're ready to route, it doesn't get in the way. So we're going to put these bits back under here where they belong. Now you're going to reintroduce the fence. Before you do that, if there's anything on the table, get rid of that. We're going to take your router, you're going to take your fence, opposite of the way you took it out. You're going to put it back on. Now, I'm going to take the camera and focus you in on this because there we go. Now what you want to do so that you can understand this is the top of these router bits right here, if you look at it, there's a ball bearing on there. And that ball bearing is used to guide across your material. But we also have a fence, which is here. The two of these, the front of this ball bearing and the fence, need to be flush with one another. So what I usually do is I take a roller and put it on there, on this part of the ball bearing, and I pull my fence up so that it's flush. So if you look straight down at this, you want that bearing right there to be flush with the fence. Now you can either use a roller or you can use a piece of wood. So if I grab a piece of wood like this, and I take this piece of wood and I push it against there, the bearing should run on both the bearing, on the fence, and the piece of material at the same time. So if you look straight down at this, that bearing is flush with that fence. So then you come over here and you snug this. Okay, and I'm going to put this back so I have two hands again. Make sure you're focused in. There we go. Good. And I'm going to put this board against there again. I'm going to pull this fence out so that it's flush with the bearing, and I'm going to snug that. Now, you want to double check. Now, don't ever check a router bit with your project. You always want to check it with a piece of scrap wood. So go over it. We have 3 or 4 bins of cut off scrap wood. Just make sure that you have at least 12 inches. You're not getting your fingers too close. Don't come over with a wee little piece of wood and try to test it. So we're going to grab a piece of scrap wood over here. Okay, let me grab my goggles real quick. So what you're going to do is you're going to test it with this piece of scrap wood first. Sometimes you need to pull this fence out a little bit so that it works. So we go like this. We grab our guard. The guard gets reinserted in, like so. The material that you're going to route gets put down on the table. You drop your guard down on it. You lift it up the same as the bandsaw, about 1/8 of an inch, enough so that you can't get your fingers in there. There we go. This can be put aside, and we want to test to make sure that the routed edge that we're going to put on is going to be adequate. So we come over here. There's an on button over here. And what that does is that put a round over on there. So if you can see, that put a round over on this one edge, and that's what we're trying to do for the footstool. Just a nice round over so that when you actually step up on a stool, that it doesn't chip this corner over time. So we're going to put that little round over on there. Whenever you route, you always route the end of your boards first, and then the edge of your board. The end of the board is if you were to is the way the tree grew, straight up and down. And if you cut the tree off with a chainsaw, these are the ends. These are the edges. You always route the ends first and then your edges. So we're going to go over here, hit the start. Rotate your board, don't flip it. If you flip it, you're going to have a round over here and a round over here. You rotate, do the other end. Now you have your round over here and a round over here. Now you do your edges. So in the end run, what you have is you have all your roundovers on all your edges. All you do after that is take a piece of sandpaper. Usually you don't have to go to 80, usually 120 is fine. You're going to take a piece of sandpaper and just hit those edges. Nothing crazy. Now there's a lot of different router bits. Some of them put a very decorative edge on there. I don't like to put a real decorative edge on a footstool because you're stepping up on this constantly and stepping and stepping and stepping. And if you had a decorative edge that had shoulders to it or steps in it, they'll rip off or break off, especially on something you're stepping on. If you're on a table where you're just using it as a dining room table or something, you can put a fancier edge on there. But for a footstool, just a round over is all we're going to do. So it gives you a general breakdown on how to change out a bit, how to put a bit in if you need one. Like I said, I can't promise you that the correct bit is always going to be in the router. There's, a cabinetry class may come in and use 3 or 4 different bits per day. So I hope that helps you out. When we're going to move on from there, the next step on the footstool, we'll go over another video, but that's going to be laying out your stretcher, and we're going to go over that. That'll be your next assignment. All right, we'll talk to you later.